The Milan Conference in 1880 that basically banned sign language worldwide. The decision at this conference was oral language is the only language. The language that makes most sense to you does not count. It is the same sort of edict that banned Alelo Hawaii in the late 1800s. So mahalo so much for staying. I really appreciate this more than you know. I should also say aloha mai kako, ojen ko'u inoa, and I am in KCC. I do teach American Sign Language and interpreter education. I'm a professional interpreter also in private practice. But, and so that sort of leads to this conundrum, and what I'm going to be talking about today is the path to parallel paths. And this is, I felt my kuleana was to find my path, to build a path to parallel paths. Yeah, I'm also into alliteration. So it's taking Alelo Hawaii and American Sign Language and figuring out how they can exist side by side in an American Sign Language classroom. And so, and also it's finding ways to connect Hawaiian culture and deaf culture, because they both have been taken down by the hands of others. And so that's a huge connection, and I want to share that with you. But how I got there is really, so I'm turning this whole thing on its head a little bit, because it's a little bit about, because it's always about me. No, it's about, it's about me and my journey through this, finding and forging my path to be able to develop a path for my students, for the haumane that are taking American Sign Language. So using, obviously, the whole model, and starting with the 4 quadrants, and looking at the why, the what, the how, and the what now. So through with the ha'ele building, again, my path, I am most connected to ho'olohe and also to ho'ohana, because those most resonate for me in how I operate in the world. But each activity that we've experienced through the cohort here has been instrumental in helping me understand how I was going to approach this project, and to identify and answer the questions I have and clarify my kuleana with this whole action plan. So the challenge, the ho'olohe and the ho'opili, the challenge is this. It's the importance of sharing knowledge in both cultures, but how is it done? How can I indigenize ASL instruction, especially when modalities and delivery differ? When I say modalities, is that American Sign Language is signed. Alelo Hawaii is an oral language. So, and delivery, we teach total immersion style, so it's only American Sign Language is used. We use very little written English. So then how then do we introduce, or we superimpose another language in language instruction? We're trying to take people who are going either from 101 all the way to 202, and we're trying to just get them to be able to meet the learning outcomes in American Sign Language, let alone layering another language on there. So I was thinking, like, I know I can do it. I can figure something out. So the other challenge is how to incorporate Hawaiian knowledge and cultural values into the instructions of another language. So the task at hand was to find the parallels through the history of language oppression. And actually, because, and I'll reveal how Kanaka Maoli and deaf people have experienced on the same timeline, literally the same timeline of language oppression, cultural oppression, and educational oppression. It was all about who was allowed to teach the language, when and where it could be used, and in its evaluation and relegation as something inferior to English. And then the shift. And so in this reveling in renewal, and also to figure out how to make connections of the Pilina so that these two groups can find themselves as allies. So, you know, I was really stumped about how to do this in a language course. So the plot thickens because really both cultures have also experienced this of being like deaf first, deaf only, Native Hawaiian first, Native Hawaiian only. I'm not recognizing at that time multiple identities. Now we're all comfortable with going, you know, we can explore all these other parts of ourselves. And so this is a perfect opportunity to be able to capitalize on this notion of identity and taking pride in one's multiple identities. So it's this understanding of representation and controlling the narrative. So things have the winds of culture and how we bring forth and investigate deaf culture and also Native Hawaiian culture is through representation and who's got control of the narrative and who has got agency. And so we also have deaf people who are Kanaka Maoli or people who are Kanaka Maoli who are also deaf. It depends on how you want to identify which one is first for you. Again, historically it was deaf first. I had a very short anecdote of a friend of mine who is from Taiwan, who is deaf. When she moved to the United States at 30, we were in the cafeteria one day talking, and she looked at me, she goes, "Why do all the Asian students sit together?" I looked at her and said, "You're Taiwanese." She didn't get it because she identified as deaf first. She did not identify as Asian. That's who she was, you know, that's who her parents are, but she identified as a deaf person. So there's a shift in going, but I can be deaf and I can also be Native Hawaiian. I can be Native Hawaiian and also be deaf. And so there's this renaissance that's happening, this really exciting sort of shift that's happening in the community now, and particularly here. So it's how people can connect their identities, and one way to do that is exploring some of the historical and cultural parallels. So, there I am, stuck in the lo'e patch. I felt like this whole, and I know that Ulani has heard me list going, I don't know how I'm going to do this, I don't know what I'm going to do. So as I said, the whole lo'e and the whole pili have just been this struggle for me, and every field trip that we had, every cultural adventure was a way for me to get deeper, literally in the mud, deeper and deeper. If you saw some of the pictures, I was covered in mud. But also to really appreciate that the lo'e patch was a place to grow from. And I felt it was my time to kilo and to consult. So mahalo to Ululani, to also Mahi, darn it, he left. Palani Kelly, also from KCC. Mama Kaivalani, she was incredible. Her intense mana just blew me out of the water and sort of shook me to my core to be able to have conversations also with my cohort pals, sort of to help me clean my roots and to be able to replant and clarify my path. So this was not only an action plan for my students, my hamana, but it's my action plan for me, and being able to figure out how I could infuse this, because this is just really one task I wanted to do as an instructor. So the Ho'ana, I felt like, you know, we weave. a'o aku, a'o mai. We share knowledge, we connect generations, we foster pinina, and perpetuate culture. Definitely. Makahana ka'ike, hands-on, minds-on, but in the deaf way. And so one way that we've been able to sort of connect both cultures here, particularly at KCC, I think it's going to start at UH Mano, but I know at KCC, we have infused Hawaii Sign Language, which is in fact a language that was validated in 2013, and not Hawaiian Sign Language. It's a different thing, and that's something that's emerging in and of itself, and that's sort of part of this project. But also there's local signs that are definitely specific to Hawaii. If you go to the continent, if I do this, if I'm doing the sign for I'm all done, there's a particular mouth grammatical move that we do, which is, but here it's pow. Yeah, and you see people go pow. Deaf hearing doesn't matter. Pow. So I have to remind myself when I go to conferences on the continent, it's like, no, wait, shift back into, like continent mode. So we teach American Sign Language with a CBE, with a cultural-based education model. And so it's through the lens of deaf culture, it's delivered in American Sign Language. So it's a total immersion curriculum, and it infuses engagement with deaf culture and history. Through notes and readings and stories. So mo'olelo is hugely important. That's another connection between the two cultures. It's would be considered an oral history, just like the language was passed from people to people. Cultural knowledge was just passed from one person to another. We have content by deaf creators. We use a lot of video. We have a lot of reflection, service learning, and other interactions with the local deaf community so that there is connection and buy-in, there's ownership from the deaf community with our students. It's also to sort of integrate those cultural norms and to see how people use language authentically. So, you go, okay, so that's what happens in classrooms where Alelo Hawaii is being taught. So how do we then superimpose them on each other? So one way is coming up with this lesson. It's something I've been percolating in my mind for years because it's conversations that my colleagues in American Sign Language and interpreting and my colleagues who teach Alelo Hawaii and Hawaiian Studies have talked about is the parallel paths that lead to current connections. This is Ho'ana. So the lesson is this. It's language, cultural, and educational oppression in the 1890s is where it all started. And it wasn't just these two cultures that experienced it. Also, Irish culture experienced the same thing at the same time. A lot of people were getting slapped around in the late 1800s. So, but I'm going to focus on Alelo Hawaii and American Sign Language. It's the similar attempts to control the hearts, the minds, and souls of two people separated by oceans and continents, and the journey back. It's that journey back to ownership. So I knew what I wanted to do, I just wasn't sure how to get there. So this is something I haven't done yet because of the linguistic complexity. So I'm still trying to figure out where it fits, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. But this is what inspired me. There is this Olelo Noeau, and there's also, this is George Vedet's. This was a presentation he made in 1913 at the National Association of the Deaf conference. It was in response to the Milan conference in 1880 that basically banned sign language worldwide and said the decision at this conference was oral language is the only language. So the language that makes most sense to you and how you organize the world through your eyes and through your hands does not count. And so it is the same sort of edict that banned Alelo Hawaii in the late 1800s. So this is what it means in the Hawaiian language, or in language we find the life of our race. Without it, we shall perish. And George Vedetz had the same concept. He was also president of the National Association of the Deaf. He was trying to lead this charge, the same concept. And so we're going to So the project that I want to do is to have the students work on a timeline, to see a parallel timeline. Because of what happened here in Hawaii, where we're talking about the establishment of Hawaiian medium schools. So you've got spoken Alolo Hawaii is ubiquitous to all of us, and we've got Queen Kipilani, she's also a champion of education. And then we've got the revival of hula, high rate of literacy in the Kingdom of Hawaii, to all of a sudden, boom, the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii and Queen Liliuokalani. This is happening at the same time that the Milan Conference is telling, this is where, again, American Sign Language is a new language in the United States. There was a group of people who were signing in Martha's Vineyard. That came from Germany. But we had all of a sudden the start of deaf schools, started in the mid-1800s. So again, that establishment was just the same. All of a sudden this language was flourishing. People who were native users were the people who were teaching. So you have deaf people teaching American Sign Language. You have Kanaka Maoli teaching Alelo Hawaii, to all of a sudden being stripped away, missionaries saying, no, you can't teach. And hearing people saying, no, you can't teach American Sign Language, you can only speak to your students, you cannot sign in school. Kids found ways to sign to each other. So you have all this going on in the late 1800s, persisting until the early 20th century, where things started to shift. But again, who had control of the schools? Who was allowed to teach? Who wasn't allowed to teach? And so in American Sign Language, you have American Sign Language finally being validated as a language in 1965. Yeah. People have been signing for centuries, but it was only validated as a distinct language in and of itself, comparable to any other language in the world, in 1965. At that point, you've got people going, oh, let's make sign language look like English. Let's make English visible. Well, you've got two different kinds of languages. They function differently because of the mode. English is linear, like one word goes in at a time. American Sign Language uses space because it's a visual gestural language. To try to smush the two together, one language or the other gets the short shrift, and those who are viewing aren't getting complete messages. When both languages are very rich in and of themselves, trying to smush them together doesn't make sense. It's like when we try to, it's sort of like, it's not even like pigeonization, because pigeonization makes sense, but oftentimes what we see with these fault systems, sign systems, that sort of just sprout up in the 60s didn't make any sense to people. So you have generations of deaf kids confused, because the other thing too that's odd is that most deaf children don't grow up in their culture, because 80% of deaf kids have parents who can hear. So they don't share the same language and culture. So going to a deaf school means that's a rich language-rich environment. Everybody signs, fully accessible language and fully accessible environment. Everything's accessible. So then you've got laws that think, oh, well, we should have the least restrictive environment that works great for certain kids. Doesn't work great for deaf kids, because all of a sudden deaf kids are being pulled out of deaf schools and put into schools with hearing peers. So now they're the only child, the only person in the whole school who signs. So now they have to learn the rules of the game for language and culture that isn't theirs. Sounds familiar, things that happen here. When you're taking kids and not letting them have the ability to speak, or actually before Punaloleo was happening, you have, Hawaiian immersion schools, and all of a sudden it's like, this makes sense. We're sharing the same culture, we're sharing the same lens, we're sharing the same cultural identity. So it's this shift that starts to happen, and the reclamation that happens in both cultures at the same time, is that the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement, happened at a time where all these other cultures are going, you know what? We're tagging along on this train because this makes sense. And this is a way for us to be able to reclaim who we are. And so this does happen in both cultures. As you see with as I said, with Punaloleo and federal policies recognizing the right of Hawaii to preserve, use, and support its indigenous language, translations of newspapers, these rich resources of what life was like in the 1800s. All this is happening, and the same thing is happening now in American Sign Language too, because both, by the way, when I started the program at KCC a few years ago, the terminal degree was a bachelor's degree. There were like very few master's programs. We actually modeled our MQs for instructors' positions off of what was happening in Alelo Hawaii instructors, because we both had the same, we were bringing people in from the community, because that's who our experts were, and they were experts, but academic credentials were just starting to happen, so that parallel was even there. So as more and more programs allowed people to get bachelor's and PhDs as terminal degrees, now you've got people doing lots of research, and it becomes, again, who's representing, who has agency. And so it is that shift, and it's this idea of being able to ike polina. It's to get these relationships, of people to understand, these students to go, you know what? We got some, we definitely have connections here, and that's what I wanted to foster. This is what I think in this kind of assignment, in a timeline, students can go ahead and choose what aspect they'd like to focus on and to be able to report on it. But this is there's a little bit of a rub. So we'll talk. So we're building the canoe here, and I want students to learn how to navigate this through footage like the George Vedit's video, which I wasn't able to show you. Darn. I was like, oh, that's gonna be so cool. And then, but research and artifacts, because there are so many that we are now uncovering in both cultures. So, Ho'opuka, what's next, is actually identifying the classes that can benefit from doing this activity. ASL 101, 102, 201, 202, not so much. They don't have enough language because we do everything. The students have to present. Like my students next week do a deaf person presentation. They get to pick anyone alive, living or dead. They have certain aspects of grammar they have to cover. It's killing them to do 5 minutes, like to stand up there and sign for 5 minutes about that. So possibly looking at our deaf culture class, which you hope to be starting to offer again, ASL 290, which is usually for our heritage speakers. Hawaiian Studies 107. Being able to then bring this also to the deaf school, the Hawaii School for the Deaf and the Blind in Waikiki, and to be able to say, okay, kids, you guys play with this. Many of these kids are Pacific Islanders, many of whom are also Native Hawaiian, and so they don't have access to that part of their culture regularly. There is this movement within the school now to do that, and then to assess. So to present the lesson, students get to pick an era or an aspect to investigate from both cultural and linguistic perspectives, and then to present it. And maybe even interview someone who has lived some recent experience in both cultures. Could be a relative, it could be, a neighbor, deaf or hearing, so someone who is Kanakamole or someone who is deaf, because they've been around long enough that they've experienced some of these shifts in perspective and reclamation of the culture and language. And then to assess and revise curriculum and to modify courses. So we think the outcome is, if this works, we have to add it into our classes. And so based on the reaction and reflection papers, peer feedback, polls that the students, I would do with the students, or any of the instructors would do with the students, would then guide us through that curriculum revision process, and also as we do our course updates every 5 years, is to be able to infuse that into our courses. So that's sort of been it's weaving all of this together, slogging through mud, being inspired by La'au and other things that we've been experiencing through this program. It's been such an incredible gift to be part of this, to be able to figure out how to do this. It's an experiment in terror, kind of like, what Robert and a few other of you have been talking about, the challenge of trying to figure it out so it works. And if it doesn't work, then you figure out a way to make it work. Back to the drawing board. That's all the cool thing about being instructors. So I want to, I am so grateful for your aloha, your embrace, your ike and mana'o, everything, all of this will continue to live in my heart. And this opportunity has led me on a new path, despite always being woefully behind and right, I catch up. Well, you're way down the pathway. I'm coming. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to present today. Thank you so much for staying. I know you're all going, I gotta go. I'm gonna hell on out. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and we'll let you know how this goes. See, we have a sign for films now.
He said
We spelled it all out.
Yeah, he spells it all out.
Oh, wow.
what is that?
This is hope. So signs have changed. We've actually got there's a video of deaf students from Gallaudet University modernizing this. This is super important. This was like amazing.